The voice of one crying out in the wilderness. It's John the Baptist crying out for righteousness. It's Oxford high schoolers crying out in lament. It's our entire Great Lakes state crying out in shock. It's 15-year-old Ethan Crumbley lost in the wilderness of his own. This past week has seen a lot of us crying. For Hannah St. Julia, age 14. For Tate Meyer, age 16. Madison Baldwin and Justin Schilling, age 17. And for the 6 students and teacher wounded by a lead shooter, Ethan Crumbley, for whom we also cry out in anger, in pain, in distress. Tuesday's shooting in Oxford was tragic, frightful, way too close to home, and will not be forgotten in any of our lifetimes. And like Columbine, Sandy Hook, Parkland, and the dozens and dozens of school shootings that have occurred in the last few decades with no substantive change in the way Americans behave towards our weapons or those most vulnerable to use them to wreak school havoc, it feels like those calling for change are also crying in the wilderness. Is there anyone listening? This is not working. Where are the changes most Americans want? Most people don't feel that they want to take guns away from hunters or anyone else who's healthy, qualified, sane, or trained to use one. Most of us simply want sensible gun laws, universal background checks, the elimination of automatic handguns and rifles, even smart technology that relies on biometrics to prevent someone from firing a gun they don't own. Can we not do better to keep our children safe? To have them run active shooter drills before and to go to crisis counseling after? Is the status quo just fine by us? No. The status quo was also not fine by John the Baptist. This was a job that he had of shaking up a world that was sleepy, stuck, and indifferent. His job is our job. And just as John's preaching was dangerous, uncomfortable, and inconvenient, so is the church's job as we approach this fragile, sticky subject of gun safety. And just as John was not a legislator, a governor, or a billionaire, John paved the way for truth by having the one thing that is most essential for solving the problems that beset us. And that's this, my friend: hope. Hope is what we need. We have been at this for quite a while. It's a minefield of a topic that great minds have been unable to find a way through for quite some time. We know we need to find a way through, and we suspect the way through is together, but it is together in hope, and hope that you and I are asked to preach and to spread. That's our job from here, folks, is to hope that things can change. We know that what we need are ways to bring our differing voices, our siloed opinions, and our politicized preferences to the table to agree that we have a problem, and then to put those great minds to use and hash out a response. And to do that means we have to keep vigilant, determined, focused, humbled, but above all, to do what the church is called to do, is to hope. Not to lose sight of the possibility for a better world, but to hold out in hope. 2 years ago, a woman named Anjanette Young went through the most harrowing experience of her life. She's from Chicago, and she was just off work when she arrived home at her townhouse, and she poured herself a glass of wine, and she was actually getting changed when a barrage of Chicago policemen broke down her door and stormed into her home. Stark naked, she was handcuffed, as she said more than 40 times, "What are you doing here? You've got the wrong house." Police didn't respond. They didn't even let her get dressed. Until later, when they finally figured out she was right, and they left. Traumatized by this incident, Anjanette called the police department and asked for an explanation. Her requests went nowhere. She went to her church and asked for help. Thankfully, a few lawyers there listened to her, and they also agreed to ask the city of Chicago for an answer. Again, they got nowhere. So these attorneys started filing paperwork to get a hold of the body cam videos from the 9 officers who broke into Anjanette's home. The city eventually coughed it up, but precluded her from airing it publicly. Well, Anjanette did it anyway, and it went viral. And it finally forced the police department to act, suspending several officers and finally admitting guilt. Justice finally came, says Anjanette. But we sure had to keep at it. Be determined, focused, and above all, hope. Anjanette was hopeful that the truth would win out, because that's what stands the test of time. When hopeful people hope for truth. When all else is rusted, washed away, and burned out, it's truth that's left standing. And that's what we're standing for. Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, the life, who promises things can get better. We can live together more safely, more harmoniously. And Jesus invites us to hope. Civil rights reform, women's rights reform, mass incarceration reform, climate change reform, all of the great reformations we're witnessing in our collective lifetimes have started with one thing: hope. And while churches may not be filled with lawyers or legislators or even activists, this is a place where we find and commend hope. God's gift to a tired, weary, battered, and bruised world, the gift of hope. How is God asking you to be hopeful today? What is that thing in your life that seems to be such a big problem that it's not even approachable? But God is asking you not to give up hope. How are we looking at that insurmountable problem before us? Is it with hope? For we have not been abandoned. We serve a God who's always with us. Many of us believe John the Baptist, who sought to reform a religion and ended up a foundation stone in the largest tradition of the world, did it all with hope. The one crying out in the wilderness believed Isaiah's words that in the end, all flesh shall see the salvation of God. Lawyer and social justice advocate Bryan Stevenson. Anybody heard of Bryan Stevenson, seen the movie Just Mercy, perhaps read a book or two of his? He's made it his life's work to bring about justice for the incarcerated. He's helped bring many wrongly convicted people from prison. You know what he says about hope? He says hope is our superpower. Hope is the enemy of injustice. When we allow ourselves to be hopeless, we become part of the problem. We give the nod to the status quo. But when we hope, when hope says, we open the doors of possibility. Possibility that things can change, that a new future can come to pass, that things can get better. John the Baptist calls us above all to be hopeful, to see that there can be a new, a different, more just, a more peaceful world. What is our role in that? It may be too soon to tell, but our role is always to be hopeful. For when we think about it, we see that there's no neutral place here. There's no middle ground. On one side, there's hopelessness, where we succumb to our problem as insurmountable, that this injustice has been here too long and won't ever be uprooted. On the other side is hope. This sees possibility, that it sees things that are fluid and always have the potential to change. We suspect John the Baptist saw this. No matter how many people told him to sit down, no matter how many people told him to pipe down, no matter how many people told him to take a shower, laughed at what he wore, what he ate, what he had to say, he did not let his hope die out. This is the job of the church as we face this overwhelmingly daunting task of gun safety. To have the moxie, the chutzpah, the outrageous gall to think that swashbuckling, gun-toting America can change. Talk about crime in the wilderness. But that's what John did. He was right. Maybe, just maybe, those of us who believe things can change are right too. Jerome Felder was born in Brooklyn. It was 1925. Just a few years old, he contracted polio. He lost the use of both of his legs. He had to walk around on crutches. Sure, this bothered him, but at least he had not lost the use of his voice or of his creative, sharp mind. You see, Jerome Felder loved music, and he was good at it. In fact, his dream was to have a #1 hit. Is that your dream, George? #1? At some point. As a young man on crutches, Jerome changed his name to Doc Pomus, and he made his living singing in a black blues club, writing songs, performing them to adoring crowds. He recorded them, he sent them off to record companies. One company loved what they heard, and he was ready to sign a contract with this recording company. But when Doc showed up at the office, the executives discovered that he was a disabled Jewish guy, and they said no thanks. But Doc still hoped. He kept writing tunes, he kept dreaming up lyrics, until one day a talented young woman agreed to marry him. And on their wedding day, Doc watched as his bride took the dance floor. Unable to dance with her husband, instead she danced with friends and relatives. As Doc looked on, certainly a little bit envious, a little bit sad, but also hopeful. 3 years later, Doc was still scribbling down his lyrics. And he found himself writing on the back of one of the unused wedding invitations, which took him back to that night when he watched his lovely wife in the arms of others. And he came up with this line, perhaps you've heard it. But don't forget who's taking you home and in whose arms you're going to be. So darling, you want to sing it now? Save the last dance for me. Doc began shopping the song around in hope. And sure enough, a band called the Drifters would record Doc's song. So would Dolly Parton, Emmylou Harris, and a host of other people. But back in 1960, it climbed and it climbed and it climbed up the charts. And finally, as Doc had always hoped, it hit #1. Friends, it all starts with hope. We can pay attention to the culture around us and surrender to the apathy and the indifference. And that's not just on the subject of gun safety, but on that nagging problem and towering dilemma that you and I brought to church today. Is it medical? Is it financial? Is it relational? We are so tempted to surrender to complaining and the status quo. Don't do it. The one crying in the wilderness says God has a way. God has a plan. Around, over, under, or straight through, God has not given up on us. This is where our gospel takes us, friends. This is where Advent takes us, as we cry to God in the wilderness for change that we so deeply desire. God has not forgotten about us. God has not given up on us. And we align with the hopefulness of God by having hopefulness for what's ahead. Our best tribute to Oxford, our best tribute to ourselves, is to embrace that hope, that promise, that surety that all will see the salvation of God.